would have thought so. First time I've ever done this.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you.
I don't know what's going to happen. Good to see you. Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
Hello. Welcome. Good afternoon. My name is Chris Arnold, and on behalf of the Bob and Alicia Woodrick Diversity Learning Center, I'm pleased to welcome you to the campus of Grand Rapids Community College. This is a really exciting time for us. Grand Rapids Community College is celebrating our 100th anniversary, and we are also celebrating our 20th anniversary of the Diversity Lecture Series. So we are celebrating our diverse voices through our Diversity Lecture Series. And just look around, this is absolutely amazing. And we are so honored to have President Carter and Mrs. Rosalynn Carter here with us. We certainly can't think of a better way to celebrate than having you here with us, so thank you for being here tonight. I'd just like to acknowledge a few individuals in our audience. Our Board of Trustees, they work very hard for our college and our community, and we thank them for their continuing support of our diversity initiatives here at the college. I would also like to acknowledge all the elected officials here tonight. Thank you for being here, and thank you for your service to our community. For 20 years, we have been able to sustain our Diversity Lecture Series, thanks to our dedicated sponsors. The series would not be possible without your generous support. Our diversity champions include Blue Cross Blue Shield Blue Care Network of Michigan, the Nokomis Foundation, and Steelcase. Thank you for being diversity champions. Our diversity advocates include our GRCC Social Science Department, who we are happy to partner with, Varnum Law, and Warner Norcross and Judd. Thank you for being advocates. And our partners include Fountain Street Church, our neighbor, Meyer, SMG Management, DeVos Place, and Spectrum Health. And you can also see a complete list of all of our diversity supporters in your program. Again, we are so grateful for all these friends and supporters, and for those of you who have continuously attended the lectures and shown your support. And if you'd like to make a donation, we always accept those, and those are handled through our GRCC Foundation, and you can get information at the information table out in the lobby. And I'd also like to thank our Diversity Learning Center staff and our GRCC diversity team for their continuing commitment, and a special thank you to all the volunteers here tonight and the Fieldhouse staff. Thank you. And just a couple housekeeping things. For those of you who parked in a GRCC ramp, when you leave, the parking gates will be up, so you'll be able to exit. You won't need a pass to get out. You'll be able to exit free, and the gates will be open from 6 until 6:45. And those of you who are here, all of our wonderful students. If you need verification that you were here tonight, you can pick up a blue verification form from the information table. And then there's an evaluation in your program. If you could please take a moment and fill that out. We really value your opinion. If there's a speaker that you would like us to consider bringing in, your input is very important to us. You can complete that and you can drop it off at the box when you exit. And you can also include your email address if you'd like to receive notices on upcoming lectures or any other programs through the Diversity Learning Center. Again, we are so proud of our history of offering diverse voices to help engage our community in global and local viewpoints. Now, I am pleased to introduce someone who believes we should challenge our worldview through the application of critical thought towards cultural understanding. And we thank him for his commitment and leadership, not only to GRCC, but to our community. Please welcome Dr. Stephen Ender, President of Grand Rapids Community College.
Well, good evening. What a wonderful, wonderful night for Grand Rapids Community College. Almost a year to the day, I was in the airplane hangar out at Ford Field at a fundraising event. My wife couldn't go, which immediately kind of made me uncomfortable because she's much better at those events than I am. But I went, and I walked in and I noticed Jim Williams. So I walked immediately over to Jim Williams because I needed to start a conversation. I needed to start to feel comfortable. Jim introduces me to this individual who I'd never met. His name was Brent Slay. And we talk, and as you do, you talk about your kids. And I talked about my son and going fly fishing with my son as a high school graduation gift. And Mr. Slay says, I just came back from a fabulous fly fishing trip with Jimmy Carter. I'm going, Jimmy Carter? I only know one Jimmy Carter. I said, is this the Jimmy Carter I know? Oh, yes, my wife Diane and I are very active with the Carter Center, and we know the Carters. You know, he actually came to Drake University and did a presentation for our social justice series. Now, as a college president, your heart is literally pounding, and your brain is, because I'm thinking, we're 100 years old next year. We're celebrating the 20th year of our Diversity Lecture Series. I could not think of a greater gift for our college and community. Brent says, well, don't get your hopes up. He doesn't do many of these. So here we are, a year later, and we are here, and I really do have to ask both Brent and Jim to stand because they are the folks that brought President Carter and Mrs. Carter to our institution, and I'll forever be grateful to both of you. And I think why I was so just in a I don't know, this intensity about just need to make this happen for Grand Rapids Community College. It starts with the roots of my family. My grandfather's immigrants, one from Germany, one from Italy, one a barber, one a baker, no formal education. And now the grandson is here with an opportunity to host and introduce the President of the United States of America. And I think that is what's so wonderful about our country, and I know that my background is not that much different than many of you in the room tonight, that we can share the space with our national and international leaders is a gift that we should all cherish, and I certainly cherish this one. So for 20 years, the lecture series has featured globally renowned guests discussing contemporary topics of concern, issues that have impact on both you and me. The Carters' work is authentic and it is inspiring. Their projects have touched hundreds of thousands of people across this country and globally, as they have advocated for improved health, foster democracies, promote peace, and support human rights. For instance, the Carters led a coalition to reduce the incidence of guinea worm disease. Yes, their results are the results are staggering in this area of their work. In 1986, there were 3.5 million cases of this painful and disabling disease, which is caused by parasites. Today, there are fewer than 148 instances, making it likely to be the first human disease since smallpox to be eradicated. And this is just one way that the Carters have improved the quality of life for citizens of our global community. Other notable accomplishments include they've observed 96 elections in 38 countries to help establish and strengthen democracies. They're furthering avenues for peace in 8 countries in the Middle East. They're helping to establish a village-based healthcare delivery system in thousands of African communities. They're strengthening international standards for human rights, and they're advancing efforts to improve mental health care. Today, they will delve into a topic that is highlighted in President Carter's latest book, A Call to Action: Women, Religion, Violence, and Power. The book draws upon the Carters' own experiences and the courageous testimony of women worldwide to demonstrate that globally, women are being denied equal rights, whether it's through the false interpretations of carefully selected religious texts or a growing tolerance of violence and warfare. When you look at the mission of the Carters and their work through the Carter Center, there are parallels to what we do here at GRCC. Consider the thousands of lives GRCC has impacted since it opened its doors 100 years ago. Our college is woven into the fabric of West Michigan, providing the educational resources our residents need to achieve their goals. It gives me tremendous pride that we have the opportunity to personally hear the Carters discuss their philosophies and their work. So now, please help me extend a warm GRCC welcome to our 39th President of the United States and Nobel Peace Prize recipient, Jimmy Carter, and his wife, Rosalynn.
Can we start now? Can we start now? Thank you. Let me say, first of all, that Rosa and I are deeply grateful and honored to be at this 100th anniversary of this wonderful community college. Grand Rapids has a special hold on my heart, because I think the finest public servant I've ever known came from Grand Rapids. Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford was my personal friend. Betty was Rosalyn's personal friend. His children were my children's personal friends. And when we had the 200th celebration of the birth of the White House, the national historians who came there to speak all agreed that the two closest associations between former presidents in history of America were between Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, and I am deeply grateful for that honor. It's also good to be at this wonderful community college. I've heard for a long time about its great achievements, and I think this diversity conference is one that really is especially important for me and for my wife, Rosalynn, who founded the Carter Center now about 35 years ago. We have a wide range of topics that we undertake. Some people ask me how do we get along since I was involuntarily retired from the White House by the 1980 election. And of course, Jerry Ford was involuntarily retired 4 years before I was, so we were familiar with that. But I think the best description of the life we have now is from a cartoon in the New Yorker magazine last year. This little boy is looking up at his father, and he says, "Daddy, when I grow up, I want to be a former president." So one big good thing about being a former president is you can do what you want to, and if you don't want to do something, you don't have to do it. So we wanted to come here, and we're very grateful for a chance to come and participate in this 100th celebration of this great university. Let me say, first of all, that the Carter Center has a wide range of topics that we undertake. We deal with peace, we deal with negotiations to resolve conflicts, we deal with the holding of multiple elections. Now I think the President announced that we had done about 96 elections in the world. But the overall umbrella under which the Carter Center operates is human rights. And I think if I asked the average student here at this college or the average parent of the students, what are the important human rights, you would probably say freedom of speech, and freedom of religion, and freedom of assembly, and trial by jury. Those are very important human rights, and they're the ones that most Americans think about. But at the Carter Center, we look at human rights in a much broader way. In many African countries where we work, I would say the most important human right that they lack is ability to live in peace, to have a home in which to live, to have enough food for their children, to have some modicum of education for a child, to have at least half-decent health care, and a hope to have a future better than the present. Those human rights are sometimes not remembered, but those are the ones in which we deal. And the Carter Center has had programs in 80 different countries in the world, and as we've been through the last 35 years of traveling in the poorest nations on earth, we began to see one pattern of human rights violations that really was kind of a surprise to me, and that is the horrible abuse of women and girls. This is something that slowly grew on us as we went into countries to teach them how to grow more food grain and how to preserve the lives of our children and so forth. And we soon began to see that almost invariably in foreign countries and in the United States of America, there are terrible abuses of girls and women that we don't even want to admit exist. I think I'll start with the worst one. I think some of you have studied the Second World War. I happen to have fought in the Second World War. I was on a submarine back in those days. My father was in the First World War. But in the Second World War, it's the most devastating conflict in history. About 40 million people in the world died in the Second World War from bombing and so forth. 40 million. 160 million girls are now missing from the face of the earth. 4 times as many. And what has happened to them is that they have been strangled at birth by their parents, or either with the advent of sonograms. Even in the poorest countries now, the parents can tell that a mother is pregnant, and they can determine that the little baby is going to be a girl. So they abort the fetus so it won't be born. In China today, there are 118 boys for every 100 girls. In India, for every 100 girls, there are 114 boys. The girls are missing because they've been killed at or before birth. And the reason for that is multiple. In India and China for many years, my mother was in the Peace Corps in China a long time ago. And she worked for Mrs. Gandhi, who required my mother, who was a registered nurse, to work on family planning. And she participated in that against her wishes. So India and China have always said, 1 is best, 2 is most. You could have 1 child, you were discouraged from having a second child, and once you had the second child, you couldn't have any more. So if another child was born, it was killed, if it was a girl. And that still goes on. Not only in those 2 countries, but in poor countries where the parents just can't afford to have a large family. And if I have two children, one of them a boy and a girl, for instance, the boy gets the best food. And if only one of them can go to school, it's a boy. So the girls are deprived of an opportunity in life, even at the time they're born and are little children. That's the worst thing about, I think, in loss of life. There's another very serious problem that takes place, as was mentioned earlier, because of misinterpretation of the Holy Scriptures by Christians and also by Muslims and others. Because the churches now are controlled by almost invariably men. And over a period of centuries, they have ruled that women are not equal in the eyes of God. So in local villages, they misinterpret that. For instance, in Africa, there is a custom of mutilating girls' sexual organs, which is against the law in some countries. The Carter Center does a lot of work in Egypt. I negotiated a peace agreement between Egypt and Israel. We go there to hold elections. And 90% of all the females now alive in Egypt have had their sexual organs mutilated. And a cutter, quite often an older woman with a razor blade, does these operations. They remove all the exterior parts of a woman's or little girl's sexual organs. This goes on in 90% of the women who live in Egypt today, and about 50% or more of most of the countries in Africa do the same thing. These are very serious problems. And women also in some countries in the Arab world and some others, 2,300 in the Great Britain last year were killed because a girl in the family was raped by a stranger. And she was a disgrace to her parents or to her family because she had been raped. And then she's killed by her father, her uncle, or increasingly by her young brother, who, if he's found guilty, won't be sentenced to long prison because he's a juvenile. I'm talking mostly about foreign countries, as you see. But in the United States of America, we have the same thing. The average woman who works in America gets paid 23% less than the average man who works in America. We have two precious institutions in our country. One is the great university system, and the other one is the military. The average woman or girl who enrolls in a U.S. university is sexually assaulted 1 out of 5 before she finishes 4 years. 1 out of 5 girls who enroll in American universities and colleges are sexually assaulted before they finish 4 years of college. And this is not something that the college administrators want known. So quite often the girl is discouraged from reporting it. 41% of all the existing senior universities have not reported a single case of sexual assault in the last 5 years. Another thing that happens is that in the military, where commanding officers have control over the prosecution of rapists, they don't want it to be known that on their ship or in their Marine battalion or in their Army troop that sexual assaults take place. So if it happens, if a girl is raped in the military, they are discouraged from making any kind of report. Last year, the Department of Defense reported 26,000 cases of sexual assault in the military. Only 3,000 of those cases were ever brought to any kind of trial. That's 1 out of 100, roughly. So those things go on in our own country, and we just look the other way because they're girls, and they don't deserve equal rights with boys or men. I was raised in the South, and I knew about the the disadvantages that came from slavery because I grew up in a segregated community. Ours was the only white family that lived in Archery, Georgia. We had 55 African-American families living around us. I saw the devastation that existed from a separate but equal ruling with the Supreme Court. 100 years after the Civil War was over. And that is another very serious problem. We have in our country now a very serious case of slavery. In fact, the slavery trade in the world now is greater than it ever was in the 18th or 19th century when black people were brought out of Africa to serve as slaves in the New World. In Atlanta, Georgia, there are between 200 and 300 people sold into slavery every month. Most of them sold into sexual slavery, girls. And the reason is that Atlanta Airport is the busiest in the world, and a lot of our passengers come from the Southern Hemisphere, where a girl's skin is either brown or black. And a brothel owner or a house of prostitution can buy a girl for $1,000. And they make an average of $33,000 a year for everyone they have in their sexual slavery. The State Department of the United States is required by the Congress now to report on slavery. And the last report they made in 2012 was that in the United States of America today, there are 60,000 people living in slavery. You see, these facts are horrible, but they're not known. And so the purpose of the Carter Center and the purpose of my book that I just wrote based on our study of this is designed to tell people the truth and to shock people into taking action. There's no reason in the world why my granddaughters and my great-granddaughters should face a world where they will be the subject of quiet and unacknowledged discrimination or persecution, or if they live in a foreign country, early death, or the mutilation of their own sexual organs. Those are the things we're trying to do away with. This is just one aspect of the Carter Center's work that I wanted to tell you about. And I hope that all of you will think about this very deeply, because as you know, the purpose of this conference series here is to let people know about the problems that exist in the world and the opportunities for improvement. And that's why we're here. I hate to talk about such a dreadful subject. And I hope in the question and answer period we might get away from this if you want to and answer some questions that are more political in nature, whatever you want. So there's no restraint on what kind of questions you ask us. And now my wife, who's a real boss of the Carter Center, will tell you about her book as well, which you see are quite different from mine, but just as important. Now I introduce my wife of 68 years so far, Rosalynn.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Go right in.
And I want to congratulate you too on your 100th anniversary, and thank you for inviting us to be here with you. It's just a great pleasure for us. I'm involved with all the Carter Center programs, but my special program is mental health. I've worked on mental health issues for 43 years, beginning when Jimmy was governor of Georgia, and I became involved campaigning here for him for governor. We got in the governor's race late because our leading candidate dropped out, and so we were left with a very segregationist candidate, and we couldn't let him have it without a fight. And so we started going around the state. Jimmy was running, and the whole family campaigned. And every single day that I campaigned, people asked me what we would do for a loved one at our big Central State Hospital. There had just been an expose of the hospital, and it had 12,000 people in it, in a space for 3,000. It was back in those days when nobody knew how to work with mentally ill, how to treat them, just sent them off to institutions. And so I was campaigning, and people were asking me, what will your husband do for my loved one who is mentally ill if he's elected governor of Georgia? And so I kept hearing it day in and day out. And so one day I was in a town campaigning and found out Jimmy was going to be there that night. So I stayed. We didn't have very much schedules. We just riding around saying, please vote for my husband. And I got in line at the end of his speech. It was a big crowd because it was really close to the election. I got in the back of the line. He didn't know I was there. I don't know about you, but standing in receiving lines is part of my life. And so sometimes you hold out your hand to the next person in line before you get through talking to the other. That happened to me. And Jimmy took my hand. He looked at me. When he saw me, he said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I came to see what you're going to do for people with mental illnesses when you're governor of Georgia." And he said, "We're going to have the best program in the country, and I'm going to put you in charge of it." Well, that appealed to me because of so much that I was hearing and people so distressed. The Community Mental Health Centers Act had been passed, but the centers had not been built, so they were moving out of the old hospitals. It was happening all over the country into communities with no services at all. So when Jimmy was elected governor, we lost that time. Very disorganized campaign. But the next 4 years later, he won. And the first month he was in office, he established the Governor's Commission to improve services to mentally and emotionally handicapped. And I did not chair that. I was not the chairman of that committee because I didn't know anything about it, but I served on it. And my goal was to travel to all the facilities in the state and come back and report to the committee, which I did. And that assured me that I was doing what I needed to do. So I have worked on for 43 years now. And we had the Governor's Commission, then I had a President's Commission. I told Jimmy to punch me when my time was up.
No, your time's not up.
Okay,
Just
well,
move
no. He was punching me. So I wrote a book about mental health in the late 1990s. I had a President's Commission, and then I have a really good program now at the Carter Center. I wrote a book, and I was going to update it about, I think, 4 or 5 years ago. And when I looked at it, everything was out of date. Everything except stigma. Stigma hangs on. The purpose of our program at the Carter Center is to overcome stigma, work to overcome stigma, and influence policy. And we have there the best mental health program in the country, I know. We have the top leaders in the field that come. And so I had to start over with my book. And I wrote, we have some themes in it, but the first chapter is about stigma, because stigma is so severe that people do not go for help because they don't want to be labeled mentally ill. But today, the overwhelming majority of people with mental illnesses, because of research and what we know about the brain, can be treated effectively and lead productive, good lives in the community. And people don't know that. But why stigma hangs on, I don't know, because almost every family in America has either a family member or a close friend with mental illnesses. And I don't know why it hangs on, but it's really, really difficult. So I wrote the first chapter. It's the greatest barrier to progress in the mental health field that there is. I go on to write about the scope of the problem. 1 in 4 people in our country will develop a mental illness in a year, every year. Mental illness is the leading cause of disability in the United States. Also in Canada and in Europe. If you add lost productivity, it's the leading cause of disability in the world. That's the scope of the problem. Then I write about the illnesses, children's mental health, mental health of adults and so forth. I go through the leading mental health facilities are the jails and prisons in our country. You can get money for jails and prisons. You can't, very difficult to get funding for mental health programs because of the stigma. And so I go through and then I talk about research. Research is, I mean, we've learned so much about the brain, and now we're beginning to put together what we've learned with what needs to be done, how the different diseases develop. And then I have the last part of the first part of the book is pretty depressing because I talk about the problems that we have, but what also needs to be done, like for children, the problems of children getting help. And but the last part is more promising because there's so many good things going on in the mental health field today. As I said, recovery is possible. We're beginning to go back to community services, which I think is going to help overcome stigma, because if we have people in integration of services, integration of mental health and substance use, and also integration of in the primary care doctor's offices, we want a mental health specialist in every primary care doctor's office. Can be such great, research has already shown that it can make a total difference. And if everybody is going to the same community center, and people in the community see people with mental illness going when they have a problem, just like other people go for physical services like when they have a problem, I just think it can be really be good for helping overcome the stigma. And the other thing that's exciting is we're beginning to include people. We call it inclusion, including people in the communities who are living with mental illness, helping them find housing, which is so important for them, jobs that are so important, but getting them involved in the community as people who are respected. And that, I think, it's really, in the places that are doing that, it's so exciting. So I want to, any of the students here planning to go into nursing, into any type of medical, I urge you to get involved in the mental health field. This is the most exciting time in all of the 43 years that I have seen in making progress, beginning to make progress. It's going to be real, I think. And so I'm just delighted to be here today and speak to you about this important issue. But remember, when you're deciding on what to do with your life, how important it is to get involved in this issue. Thank you.
Thank you. How are you going to thank you.
Thank you, President and Mrs. Carter, for your sharing your words of wisdom with us. I would now like to introduce Mr. Mike Light, Professor of American History and Department Chair of the Grand Rapids Community College Social Science Department, who will facilitate our question and answer session.
Thank you, Chris. Mr. President, Mrs. Carter, you may not know that hundreds of students across campus have been reading your book as part of their curriculum for this semester. So that's super exciting for us. And in our department, Dr. Robert Hendershot's History of American Foreign Relations class has also been reading the book. And we asked the students to come up with some questions for you tonight. And they're good. I read through them earlier. They're really good. And there are questions for both of you, so I think I'm just going to flip back and forth. We'll start with you, Mr. President. Your administration attempted to place a commitment to human rights at the vanguard of U.S. foreign policy concerns. Unfortunately, we see this noble attempt as an anomaly in the broader history of American foreign relations. And we note through our studies that usually security and economic considerations not only take priority over human rights, but are often detrimental to human rights. Do you agree with this statement? And if so, what must be done to truly direct U.S. foreign policy toward ending systematic discrimination and human rights abuses?
Well, I'll try to be brief. We had a very wonderful event after the Second World War when Eleanor Roosevelt, the widow of Franklin D. Roosevelt and others, assembled and drafted and passed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which exists of just 30 simple paragraphs. And it basically describes a complete picture of what a perfect organization or a perfect moral value establishment or what a perfect nation would do. And those 30 paragraphs have been called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But in recent years, these have been pretty much abandoned around the world. I wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times last year, and I pointed out that the United States is now violating 10 of its 30 paragraphs. When I became president, I remembered those times when I described to you when I was a child living among African-American people and saw how their basic human rights were violated. So I decided that I would make human rights the foundation of American foreign policy. So every ambassador of the United States was designated by me as president as my personal human rights representative. And if anybody in that country was persecuted by their leaders, they could come to our U.S. Embassy and they would report to me, and I would do the best I could to correct that problem. And that was a very wonderful signal to people, not because I had the influence, but because the people, if encouraged, would solve their own problems. So I think one of the results of that was that when I was elected president, almost every country in South America was a military dictatorship. Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, Argentina, Chile, Ecuador, and so forth. I'll go down the whole list. And within 7 years of giving the people a right to honor their own human rights, they became democracies. Every single one became a democracy. And now only one country in Latin America is looked upon as not being a democracy of some kind, and that is Cuba. So I think that what people need around the world is a chance to know what their human rights are, like women that I mentioned earlier, and then over a period of time we can correct the problem. But the question is, do I still think we have a problem in this country and around the world? And the answer to that, simply speaking, is yes, we have a serious problem, and everybody that believes in human rights needs to do our own share. It might be a very small portion of the effort to make these changes come true and let the honest enforcement of human rights be implemented all over the world.
Thank you. Mrs. Carter, this one's for you. As former First Lady of our nation, and as someone who's had great experience in the global struggle for human rights and equality, what do you consider to be the greatest cause of gender inequality and discrimination that continues to characterize modern American society?
That's a question for Jimmy.
The one I just mentioned, really.
Jim, the one I think that was such a revelation to me is the sale of women, young girls, in Atlanta, Georgia, because I had no idea this was going on until Jimmy got involved in, and it just hurts me so bad to know about these little girls. Also, with our, we have so many programs overseas. 35 of them are in Africa. They're in the poorest, most isolated countries in the world, and they don't know, they're beginning to know because of television, but they don't know what their rights are. And that's a problem. As Jimmy said, what he just said about educating people, women and girls, about their human rights. And I also think it's a human right to good health care, and mental health care is one of the ones that I like to, I was pleased to talk to here today and to talk about it because I want people to know that treatments are effective now and that people can live good lives. And they should have good mental health care, which is not available to everybody now. Thank you.
Thank you. President Carter, as part of your his farewell address in 1961, President Eisenhower warned the American people of a growing military-industrial complex and its unwarranted influence on American policymaking. To what extent does this military-industrial complex continue to influence the country today? And has a historical military-industrial complex inhibited the formation of foreign policies which advance human rights?
Well, one of the greatest violations of human rights is the inability to live in peace. And if you go around the world and ask people which is the most warlike country on earth, which one do you think they would respond? The United States. Since we left the Second World War, and even before, but since we left the Second World War, the United States has been almost constantly at war in some part of the world. We've been in about 30 combats with different countries since the Second World War. Now we've just gotten involved in another one. I can't say that all of them were mistaken to be done. I think the First World War, the Second World War were very worthwhile. Some of the ones have not proven to be well. So I would say that the military-industrial complex, that is the manufacturers of all kinds of weapons, are very influential in the Congress and in the country as well. And so we know that they make a lot of profit when we are involved in buying weapons. And that includes submarines like I served on, or battleships like I served on, as well as tanks and armored vehicles and artillery and so forth. So this is something about which all Americans need to guard. I happen to be a Christian. Maybe many of you are as well. And we profess to worship the Prince of Peace, not the Prince of War. And I think whenever we have a chance as individual citizens to make a choice between going to war and trying to avoid armed conflict whenever it's possible, we ought to lean in that direction. When I was elected running against Gerald Ford, one question, for instance, that involved me and Gerald Ford together, in 1976, when we didn't know who was going to be elected, there was a big problem about whether the United States was going to build a B-1 bomber. And we agreed and announced publicly that no matter which one of us was elected, in June of 1977, our first 6 months in office, we would announce either to build or not build the B-1 bomber. And I happened to be elected, and in June, after studying it a lot, I announced we would not build the B-1 bomber, and we didn't. But they had planned it so that little parts of the B-1 bomber were built in all the congressional districts of the very important members of Congress. It's not an accident. And then when my successor came in office, I won't call his name, but he's from California, and his first name is Ronald. He said, we'll build a B-1 bomber anyway. So we built 100 of those and never used them. So that's how powerful the arms manufacturers can still be and influence Congress to build weapons that we don't need. And quite often the Joint Chiefs of Staff say we don't need a weapon, and the Congress will say we'll build it anyway. So they are very powerful now. We need to guard against any, I think, lobbying groups that gets more powerful than the people that the congressmen are supposed to represent.
Mrs. Carter, you already touched on this, but the students would like to know, you've been involved in mental health issues for almost 50 years now. As you think about your work and how it impacts women, what do you see as the greatest hurdle that women face today with regard to dealing with mental health issues?
The greatest hurdle to good mental health care is stigma. It is far more damaging.
Explain what stigma is, because they might not hear.
Stigma is leads to discrimination against people with mental illness. Stigma is caused when people think wrongly about a problem, and it's so ingrained in our minds, in the minds of people, that that something's wrong with the brain. Actually, when we've been working to overcome stigma, we have learned that that saying, which we have been doing in the mental health field for years, if you say, the brain is just like any other part of the body. If you have a heart problem, there's no stigma. We had cancer, there was stigma against cancer until the cure was found, a possibility of a cure. But if you have diabetes, there's no stigma. There's stigma against mental illnesses. And we found out that saying it's just like any other part of the body is the wrong thing to say, because the polls show that when people learn that something's wrong with your brain, that makes them even more afraid. And so we're trying to find now how to overcome, there's so much research going on now on how to overcome stigma. And I read once that the best way to overcome stigma is to learn that person you talk to over the back fence in your yard, if anybody does that anymore, is to learn that that person is living with schizophrenia, with bipolar disease. You're not afraid of him or her. You know them, you've seen that they have a good family life and they care for their children and they go to work, so many of them every day. Some of them don't, but the overwhelming majority can live a good life in the community. So overcoming stigma is the greatest barrier of all other barriers.
Thank you. President Carter, how do your views on humanity and human rights translate to the LGBT community's struggle for equality around the world and here at home in the United States? And how do your religious convictions play into your views?
Well, I never knew of any word or action of Jesus Christ that discriminated against anyone because of whom they were. And the sexual orientation of a person is just like the color of their skin, or whether they're poor or evil, or poor or rich, or whether they live in a foreign country or our country. So I think discrimination against anyone and depriving them of actual equal rights in the United States is a violation of the basic principles of the Constitution that all of us revere in this country. So no discrimination against anyone is the best. Treat everyone equal in the eyes of God, and everybody equal in the eyes of our Constitution, and also equal in the eyes of the laws that our congressmen pass. So we ought to have that attitude to other people. In the eyes of God, they're just as good as we are.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions. Both of them were designed for you, President Carter, but if you both want to speak to them, that'd be fantastic. Since the region is only briefly mentioned on a call to action, what is your opinion, or what information do you have available regarding women's rights issues in Latin America, particularly in areas going through political turmoil today? And is the Carter Center planning on getting more involved in Latin American countries?
Well, the Carter Center has always been deeply involved in almost every Latin American country. We've done 4 elections, for instance, in Venezuela. We've done 5 elections in Nicaragua. We were active now in Bolivia and so forth. I need not go into detail about that. But one of the serious problems of poverty, and many of the Latin American countries are stricken with very poor people, is that it's the poor families that suffer most. And as I mentioned earlier, if a poor family has 1 or 2 children, they have a mistaken idea that when they get old and they don't have civil service like we do, or don't have Social Security like we do, that their boys will take better care of them. One of the points I make in my book is it's very likely that if you are old and you have 2 children, 1 a boy and 1 a girl, the girl's going to take care of you. So poverty is one. Strangely enough, there's a ranking of all countries in the world about which one has the most equality between men and women. The United States ranks 23rd in the list. The highest ranking country in this hemisphere is Nicaragua. Nicaragua ranks 7th in the world. And the only countries that rank above Nicaragua are the Scandinavian countries and Switzerland. So strange enough, Nicaragua ranks very high because during happened to be while I was president, the revolutionaries overthrew a dictator in Nicaragua, and the women fought side by side with men to bring about freedom to that country. And after the war was over, the women insisted that the men who were then changing the Constitution and all, give them equal rights. So I think that when women are treated equally in all aspects of life, they can overcome that handicap and live accordingly. So I would say Latin America is coming along quite well now with human rights. As I said, all of them are, in South America, military dictatorships are gone and they have democracies. So I don't think there's any particular stigma or derogation or second rating of women who live in Latin America compared to North America or compared to Europe.
Thanks. And the last question for you, Mr. President. Are elected officials ethically justified in using real or perceived tragedies to motivate the public toward armed conflict? And the students actually listed some examples of the recent beheadings of American citizens by ISIS, 9/11, Pearl Harbor, etc.
Well, there are times in our history and times in current events when I think the United States is justified in using violence. And I personally agree with what President Obama decided in the case of Iraq, where ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, decided to go into Iraq with almost complete ability to move. And one reason was that the leaders of Iraq, who are Shia Muslims, had discriminated against the Sunni Muslims. And we tried to stop that earlier, but we couldn't do it. So the Sunni Muslims that lived in the western and northern part of Iraq, when the ISIS people came in, they said, well, these Sunni Muslims, although they're terrorists, are better than the government we know in Baghdad. So I think that in the future, we also have the Kurds who are fighting for their independence and for rights in the northwestern part of Iraq. I think on the ground, we'll have some strong support from the Kurds and some of the military of Iraq. And I think if the United States provides drone attacks and maybe bombing raids and let the people on the ground help them, that would be okay. The big problem with that, though, that President Obama and our military has not yet had to face is a very serious one. Because when the ISIS forces go into a city and take it over, and then the United States goes over there with bombers and drops bombs, we are very likely to kill more civilians than we do ISIS members. And that's why it's very necessary for us to have our own people on the ground that can give us accurate information about exactly where to let a missile land or a bomb land to make sure it kills the ISIS terrorists instead of normal civilians. On the other hand, I think it's a mistake for us to start bombing in Syria because we don't have any reliable people on the ground in Syria. The Carter Center is deeply involved all over Syria. We draw the only map that exists in the world showing where the different forces are inside Syria. And so we know where ISIS is, we know where others are, but we don't have anybody on the ground that will really support us. We're not for the Assad government, and we call on so-called moderate opponents of him, moderate rebels. The moderate rebels, according to what we have found, are mostly living in Turkey or in Paris or in Rome or in London. They're not on the battle lines. And so we don't really have any forces on the ground in Syria that can tell us where to drop bombs, or if we are successful, they can go in and take over from ISIS. I think there you draw a very subtle line. In Iraq, we have some allies on the ground that can guide our bombers to do accurate bombing and not kill civilians and also take over when we prevail. That's good. But in most cases, I would say in 75% of the wars we've been in since I've been alive, we shouldn't have been involved in war. We should have found a peaceful way to resolve the differences. That's my opinion.
That's all the questions we have for tonight, and on behalf of the GRCC students and faculty, we want to thank you for allowing us to have this conversation with you. Thank you both.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, President Carter and Mrs. Carter, again for celebrating our 100th anniversary and our 20th anniversary of our lecture series. Thank you for being here. We're so honored. For those of you who would like to purchase a book, President Carter's book, A Call to Action, there are signed copies in the lobby.
Thank you. Good job.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.